Today I'm tackling the second task on my to-do list from the Claude certification, which is select the appropriate agentic review architecture. So Claude has a plan mode. It can also execute things directly, or you might have to break stuff up into smaller chunks, so more planning, and execute each one of those independently. I'm doing something similar like that now, which I'll talk about in a minute. So apparently I got all of this wrong, and it's hard to imagine because this isn't a really technical thing. It's more of a judgment call. When do you want to use the plan mode? When do you want to let Claude execute something directly? And when does it need to create a set of plans that it then executes one at a time? That's basically the premise. And so I went through and did my homework or study, and this is the set of scenarios and takeaways that I have come up from that particular task. So the basic premise, like I said before, is you as the architect have to decide between Claude's planning mode, direct execution, or multi-phase workflow. Now, personally, I absolutely love the planning mode. I use the planning mode maybe more often than I need. And I do use it primarily in Cursor, less so in Claude, but I do use it for even if I'm working on a single file and I have, like, one of the things that I'm working on right now is rewriting older application into a more modern standard and updating it as I go along. And I literally take one page at a time, feed it to Claude and or Cursor, and basically say, go look at this legacy code, and we're going to apply this new template to it, this new way of working with it, and we're going to reuse the same logic. If we can reuse the database logic, we will reuse the validations. And by reuse, I mean rewrite them, but rather than me specifying each and every one of those things, I pointed at these legacy files. And so I don't just give Claude or Cursor just the file and that prompt and say, just go do it. I have it create a plan. And what I found over time is the plans do get better and better. So in other words, planning mode a year ago, or I'm not even sure it was out a year ago, I guess about 9 months ago, it was much worse than it is today. Today's planning mode is really sort of on point. But before, you always had to work with it. So in other words, it generates a plan. You still have to iterate through that plan with maybe 6 or 7 prompts before you get it to a point where you're comfortable enough to just turn it over to the AI and let it do whatever it's going to do. So I love plan mode, and I say that because I do use it quite often. But for the Claude certification exam, this is not something that we do each and every time. So essentially, plan mode is used in some specific scenarios. So plan mode is kind of self-explanatory. We give Claude a task, and Claude figures out what it needs to do, and it documents that. We read that documentation, and the documentation is kind of like a blueprint for Claude to build whatever it is that it's working on. And after that, we can say, all right, this plan looks good. We've made all the refinements. We know where you're going to save things. We know what you're going to do. Just go and do it. And then Claude kind of executes against that plan and does the work. The next thing is direct execution. And direct execution is also pretty straightforward. This is where you basically just say, hey, Claude, like, go fix this. Like, I don't know what you were thinking, but go rewrite this, or go fix this problem that exists. And like, I use that quite a bit, again, in Cursor as opposed to Claude. I use it in places where I have a visual something on the screen. Cursor has an integrated browser. and a tool that lets me select HTML elements within that page. And so I would select like a block, a div, or something along those lines and tell it to revise it in some way. And rather than planning that, I just let it do it because it's a very small, very simple thing, and really planning is not required. So in my mind, that's what direct execution is, and that is basically the definition of it. So we're just letting Claude do his thing. Then, of course, we have something like multi-phase workflow. And a multi-phase workflow is basically too big or complex for a single plan and execution cycle. So I'm rewriting a big application right now from legacy .NET Framework into .NET Core. And one of the things that I'm doing is handling it piece by piece. So I didn't come into Claude and basically say, hey, Claude, look at this legacy application, and let's go ahead and create this same application using .NET Core instead. Instead, I worked with Claude on the architecture of the application. I knew I wanted to create a queuing service, so we used Hangfire for that. I knew I wanted to separate the logic in this application better, so create a dedicated layer for my data transport objects, create a dedicated layer for my business logic, which was very important for this particular application, and overall just restructure the application code from its legacy format into this new modern enterprise level architecture. So these things are not something you can do in a single prompt or even in a single planning session. These things are separate projects sometimes that are part of a bigger solution. They require a bigger investment from Claude and from you in order to get that right. And so that is what I consider a multi-phase workflow. And that's how I defined it here. It's basically work that is too big and complex for a single plan execution cycle. Okay, so what does all this mean, and how do we determine whether we should plan, have Claude directly execute, or do this multi-step workflow? And the short answer here is we want to look at the scope of the project. So how big is the work? If the work is small enough and low risk enough, then we can just let Claude execute it without doing any planning whatsoever. If, however, a misstep in this, even if it's just one or two lines of code, if we're modifying something in production and there's potential that it'll bring production down, we must see a plan. That plan must be approved, and then we can execute on it. And finally, if a human is in the loop, HIDL is human in the loop, if approvals are required along the way, we absolutely have to get sign off. Then at this point, it's either a multi-step workflow or at the very least a planning session. We cannot say, Claude, go execute this, and then have somebody review what was done and deployed to production. We have to have a plan. That plan's reviewed. We execute. The execution is tested and reviewed, and then we release. So that's how I now understand these three things to be, as opposed to looking at whether it's a small change or a big change and kind of going from there. So apparently my mindset wasn't in the right place for the exam to find these, to identify these correctly. So let's take a look at some of the scenarios that come up. And first thing I should say, again, planning allows us to review what changes we're going to make versus just having to perform diffs or roll something back. And the reason why I don't like that is because even if you burn some tokens on the plan, it is likely less tokens than if you have to undo changes later. Obviously, it depends on the change, but I always like to see a plan. Maybe I'm old school, but I always like to see a plan as opposed to letting this thing run wild. But the counter argument to that is that planning does add overhead, it does burn tokens, and for simple changes, it's just not necessary. So you could always say that if it's something very simple, very small, we could just execute it. But anything else, we really have to kind of consider what the right approach is. And so your first scenario here is we have Claude needs to fix a single file with a small fix. And so this is exactly what we've been talking about it. We're going to let Claude just do it. And for me to memorize these and understand them a little better, I added these memes here, and they'll help me remember these scenarios when the appropriate time comes. For scenario number 2, we have a refactoring across multiple files, and we're refactoring an authentication piece, which obviously if this fails, this is going to cause some major headaches. So we have to plan it because as a failure, it will impact production users and systems. Scenario number 3 is we're modifying a DB script, but approvals are required. Therefore, we have to plan it. And so that means we're going to get a plan. We're going to get that plan approved. After the plan is approved, we're going to do the work, and we're finally going to deploy it. Moving on, scenario number 4, we have a developer looking at a brand new code base. And this one I think got me because typically when I look at a code base with an AI agent, I do put it into either ask mode or planning mode, and I ask it to scan the code base and, try to explain all these things to me. And so here I just would immediately assume that it's probably a planning scenario. But as it turns out, this is a just do it scenario. In other words, we're just going to execute because explaining the code base is a read-only task. We're not actually asking Claude to modify anything. Therefore, technically, if it writes a plan, it's going to write a plan on how to look at the source code so it can explain it to you or write this stuff out. But it really isn't going to benefit you in any way versus you asking questions. Scenario number 5 is we're building a complex system with approvals at different stages. So the approvals and complex immediately signal multi-phase workflow. So the assumption here being that a single plan can accommodate maybe a feature out of that list, but it cannot deal with the full scope. Kind of like the project that I just mentioned where I'm converting a legacy application to a modern architecture and structure. And this is something that I can't do in a single prompt or even in a single planning session. I need multiple planning sessions. I need multiple ways to look at different things. And so that's your multi-phase workflow. Scenario 6 is Claude is starting to fix something. You basically told it, like, go ahead and fix this file. This is just a bug. And Claude's looking at the code and it realizes that it can't just fix this bug without impacting other files and other teams. So it started out as a simple fix, but Claude's reporting that, well, I'm going to modify all these other things. So you have to stop Claude and you have to put it into planning mode. The problem that I have with this specific scenario number 6, is that if you told Claude to go ahead and fix this bug in this file, unless you told it explicitly not to touch other files, it's going to just do whatever it's meant to do. So in other words, if it discovers that, oh yeah, look at this, I have interfaces and I have all this other all this other stuff that's dependent on this file, I'm just going to go change it because I'm not in plan mode. I'm already in direct execution. So this scenario kind of bothers me because I don't really understand how that would work out. Like, at what point do you stop it? Do you see that maybe you're you're not putting Claude into automatic mode where it's actually prompting you every time it's trying to change a file, and you realize it's changing more files. But if it's all on auto mode, I'm not sure how you would realize that. And the last scenario, scenario number 7, is that we have a 2-line change in the production configuration. And this one probably also got me on the exam, although I don't remember the specific question that it would have been. But the idea here is that I'm changing something in production, and this potentially requires change management and approvals and all these other things, and therefore must be planned. You should not assume that just because it's a 2-line change that the risk level is low. There is potential for downtime. There's potential for a number of different things to go wrong with that 2-line change. And so we want to make sure we plan it and work on it accordingly. All right, so this is my second task from the Claude examination that I didn't score highly on. So now that I've gone through this exercise, I do understand it better. I do think I'll remember this better. And hopefully when I take the test again in a couple of weeks, I will be able to pass.